This morning we're going to watch the first few minutes of a film adaptation of Herman Melville's short story, Bartleby the Scrivener. And I wanted to give a little introduction to it, both to explain it and apologize for it. Now the apology is simply for the visual quality of the film and the music. This is music you will remember and probably make fun of. It was produced by the Encyclopedia Britannica Educational Corporation in 1969 for use in classrooms, and that's where I first encountered it. In fact, I will always remember the first day of my junior year in high school when I walked into my father's Bible class and he showed us this film right up until the last 5 minutes. Then he paused it and announced that he would show us the end of the story at the end of the semester. And then we spent the rest of that semester discussing the problem of sin. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Bartleby, which none of us were in our junior class, and you don't know the ending of the story, I will tell you what it is after we watch this clip. But this will give you a brief introduction to the characters in the story, and to Bartleby, and to his problem.
Brown, Serenade, Brown, his wife, the city and county of New York, state of New York, part of the first part, 4, and in consideration the sum of $3,000, lawful money of the United States, with them in hand, paid by Alexander Russell, the city of Rochester, county of Monroe, and said state party of the second part, and or before the ensealing and delivery of these presents, the receipt whereof is hereby acknowledged, on the said party of the second part, is heirs, executors, and administrators, forever released and discharged from the same of these presents, granted, bargained, sold, 18, revised, released, conveyed, and confirmed, and by these presents granted, bargained, sell, elite, with the said part of the second part, to his heirs, besides, forever, all that lot said.
Yes. I've come in answer to your advertisement. Oh, yes, of course. Come in here, please. Sit down. Your name?
Bartleby.
Well, Bartleby, first I should explain to you that I've recently had the good fortune to be named a master in chancery. That's a very rewarding office, but it does add a great deal more work for my clerks. There are many additional documents to be copied on.
And reversions, remainder, and remainder.
Are you an experienced law copyist?
I am.
Well, I pay the usual rate, 4 cents per 100 words. Would that be satisfactory to you?
That would be satisfactory.
When can you begin to work?
Immediately.
Well, Bartleby, work you shall have. Bartleby, come here, please. I have some copy to examine.
I would prefer not to.
Bartleby, did you misunderstand me? I have some copy to check against the original. Come in here and help me.
I would prefer not to.
Prefer not to? What do you mean, prefer not to? I want you to compare this sheet. Here, take it.
I would prefer not to.
Examine this with me.
Yes, sir.
To all persons to whom these presents shall come, Edward Masters of the city and county of New York, the state of New York sendeth greeting, colon. Bartleby, quick, I'm waiting.
What is one?
The copies you made, we're going to examine. Here.
I would prefer not to.
Bartleby, why do you refuse?
I would prefer not to.
These are your own copies we're going to examine. They'll save you work. We can check all 4 sets at once. It's common practice. Every copyist is expected to help examine this copy. Isn't that so? Can't you speak? Answer me.
I prefer not to.
You refuse to do what I ask when you know it's common practice and common sense.
Yes, I prefer not to do as you ask.
You might imagine, on that first day of our junior year in high school, Bart became something of an instant hero to our 16 and 17-year-old minds. My father didn't immediately reveal the end of the story to us, as I said, but that didn't stop us from trying out a few I would prefer not to's on our teachers over the next few days. Though I don't remember any of the particulars, that obviously didn't go over very well because we still completed plenty of homework by the end of the year. Now, if you aren't familiar with the story of Bartleby, you saw the gist of it there in just that first 5 minutes. For whatever reason, and no reason is ever given, Bartleby decides that he would prefer not to comply with his employer's request. At least, that's where it begins. In time, Bartleby stops doing all his work, but refuses to leave his job, even refusing to leave the building eventually. The lawyer tries everything he can think of to help Bartleby, bending over backwards time and time again to accommodate him. In fact, the lawyer eventually moves himself to a new office instead of taking steps to have Bartleby forcibly removed. And when others subsequently come in and threaten Bartleby with prison if he doesn't leave the vacated premises, the lawyer invites Bartleby to live in his own home. All of this, Bartleby refuses. And eventually, he ends up in prison, where his former employer continues to visit him, still trying to help him, even giving money to Bartleby's fellow prisoners in an effort to ensure that Bartleby is taken care of, as well as one can be taken care of in prison. But Bartleby's general refusal at life finally progresses to meals. When asked one day if he would like to have his dinner, his response is, "I would prefer not to." Shortly after that, the lawyer comes to see him again, and Bartleby has died. And Herman Melville ends his short story with the lawyer's cry, "Ah, Bartleby! Ah, humanity!" Now, as you might imagine, there are a great number of different ways people try to analyze this story. But in the context of our junior year Bible class, we came to see and understand that sin, at its most basic level, is a simple yet persistent, I would prefer not to. Sin doesn't have to be violent or flashy or nasty to be destructive. It can even continue to do its toxic work when we are in situations where we are forced into outward compliance. For example, there was one day a kindergarten teacher who was having trouble getting a little boy in her class to sit down in his chair. He was being obstinate and stubborn, as little boys can sometimes be, and the teacher was required to resort to some extreme measures to get him to comply. Finally, after a long battle, the boy plopped down into the chair with his arms crossed, glaring at his teacher, and he said, "I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm still standing up on the inside." Now, I realize that's quite an elementary story. Pardon the pun. But it is a very good example of the ultimate problem God is facing when it comes to sin. That forcing someone into outward compliance doesn't necessarily solve the root of the problem. And John makes a simple yet profound statement about that fundamental reality. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, he writes, "Everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness." This is a pretty well-known verse. You may have heard it before, but often I think we just sort of read over it, not realizing that there's something very important here. Let's notice what the text does not say. It doesn't say, everyone who breaks the law sins. That's interesting, isn't it? Because isn't that how we usually think about sin? We say that someone has sinned when they've done something bad or wrong. We say that breaking the law is sin. But John is saying just the opposite, actually. He says it's not breaking the law that leads to sin, it's sin that leads to breaking the law. For everyone who sins breaks the law. In other words, if you are breaking the law, it's because you've already sinned. And if that seems a little strange, John goes right on to clarify any potential misunderstanding by defining sin as lawlessness. In other words, sin is an attitude that starts in your heart. It's something that works its way from the inside out, not from the outside in. Now that's the fundamental difference between these two general understandings of sin. The first one, which most Christians espouse, places sin squarely in the behavioral category, defining sin as a problem of bad actions. But John's definition places sin squarely in the attitude category, defining sin as a problem of rebellion or lawlessness. A friend of mine used to ask this question from time to time at our weekly Bible study. Is a blind, deaf, mute, quadriplegic capable of sinning? That question helps to nail down very quickly what you believe the problem of sin to be. Is a blind, deaf, mute, quadriplegic capable of committing sin? In other words, is sin primarily about behavior, what we do, or is it about an attitude? Well, if conquering sin were really just about refraining from bad actions, then Jesus shouldn't have had any problem with the Pharisees, now should he? After all, nobody was as righteous as they were. They followed God's law meticulously, and they were scrupulous in their efforts to get others to follow it as well. In fact, as a nation, they came up with hundreds of additional laws in order to create new boundaries designed to keep them from going anywhere near breaking those original laws. By all appearances, their outward behavior was exemplary. Yet Jesus scolded them for being rotten to the core. It shouldn't surprise us that what Jesus said about sin was consistent with what John wrote in his letter. After all, John heard Jesus' teachings on morality firsthand. And here's a great example, one we looked at recently in our daily devotional online. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." At first, this might seem highly unfair. That is, if you define sin as bad actions. If you think bad behavior is the problem with sin, then a person who looks lustfully at a woman, even spends hours upon hours fantasizing about her, but never actually commits the sex act with her, that person should be commended, not condemned. After all, this is a person who has weathered the storm of temptation and refrained from committing that bad act. Hallelujah! Except God doesn't define sin as bad actions. He defines sin as an attitude problem that, if left unchecked, will inevitably lead to bad actions. You see, if the lust in the heart isn't dealt with, it will inevitably spill over into the outward behavior. That's why the attitude is the real problem. If you fix the behavior and not the attitude, you get the Pharisees, and you still end up with God on a cross. When we contemplate sin, we get all hung up on the actions part. But God has made it clear that He's more concerned with our attitude than our behavior. And this isn't just New Testament theology. In our scripture reading from Numbers this morning, we saw that all the way back there with the Israelites in the wilderness, the ultimate problem God faced was the problem of defiance. Now, if you unintentionally fail to keep any of these commands the Lord gave Moses, the priest is to make atonement for the whole community. They'll be forgiven, for it was not intentional. But anyone who sins, what? Defiantly, anyone who does that blasphemes the Lord, and they must be cut off from the people of Israel. Whether they're native born or foreigner, there's no favorites here. It don't matter if you're Israelite or some other nation. If you are defiant, you're to be cut off. Now, did you notice that God's edict to Moses doesn't really have anything to do with the behavior, does it? It has to do with the attitude and the motives of the person who has done the behavior. Under this theory, two people could commit the very same act, right? But it would have very different consequences depending on whether that act was committed intentionally or not. In the first scenario, unintentional sin, the community or the individual was to bring an offering to God. The very act of bringing the offering was an indication that there was still a relationship between God and that person, that they still recognized God to be in some position of authority. However, in the second scenario, defiant sin, the offender was cut off from the entire community. This was designed to be an indication of the consequences of defiance and rebellion, it ends relationships. It cuts us off from God and from each other. Now, this focus on the attitude of lawlessness does not mean that bad behavior doesn't matter at all. Bad acts done unintentionally still hurt people. But God can heal and fix all of that. He can even heal our hearts as long as we have an attitude of trust and cooperation with Him. That's why, for God, the real problem is a rebellious attitude. The real problem is that persistent, I would prefer not to. Because He can't do much of anything with a person who's defiant. Now, there's an interesting note for us to consider about the language there in verse 30, which is the last sentence. The Hebrew word translated defiantly there is rum. I think I pronounced that right. It's spelled R-U-W-M, Hebrew word rum, which means to rise up, to be lofty, to exalt oneself. Interestingly, it's the same word used in Isaiah 14:13 when God describes the fall of Lucifer, the brilliant and once holy angel who corrupted himself through pride and rebellion and became Satan, God's adversary. Here's what God said about him. But you, Lucifer, you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. The word that's translated there as raise is the same Hebrew word that means defiance. So inherent in this rebellious attitude God is describing is the motivation to get out from under God's thumb, or to not be beholden to anyone or anything. It's not just a matter of accidentally doing something wrong, or even acting out of bad habits when our desire is to do better. Defiance is about telling God to shove it. That's the lawlessness John is speaking of in 1 John 3. God can't do anything for us if we're unwilling to change our attitude. To return to the story I used at the beginning, if the whole idea of salvation could be compared to sitting down in a chair, the fact is that God won't ultimately force us to sit down. In the process of trying to get through to us and save us, He may get us to sit down for a time. He may even temporarily strong-arm us into the chair in order to shock us and get our attention so that we might listen to Him for 2 seconds. But if we stubbornly continue to think, I'm still standing up on the inside, if we're determined never to listen and never to surrender, then we'll eventually destroy our relationship with God just like Satan did. When we contemplate sin, we get all hung up on the behavioral part. But God has made it clear that He's much more concerned with our attitude than with our behavior. That's why He says, please, please let me help you adjust your attitude. For if our attitude toward Him is right, then He can take care of any residual behavior problems we have. But if our attitude toward Him is not right, there's not much He can do for us. That's how He could call David, King David, who engaged in adultery and killed his best friend to cover it up. That's how He could call David a man after His own heart. And how He could commission Saul, executioner of the Christians, to become the greatest apostle who has ever lived. If God can get a hold of us on the inside, He He can take care of the outside. But he can't deal with sin from the outside in. Sin is a problem in the heart. So, is a blind, deaf, mute, quadriplegic capable of sinning? Of course. But all God needs from him or from any one of us is to be willing to sit down on the inside. All God needs is for us to stop saying, I would prefer not to, and be willing to listen. Once we do that, our comprehensive restoration, inside and out, is a foregone conclusion. Amen.